Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where every whisper echoes through centuries of tradition, a future king wrestles with fears that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. What happens when the weight of a crown becomes too heavy to bear, and family bonds threaten to unravel the carefully woven fabric of royal duty? In the shadows of state dinners and ceremonial duties, Prince William watches his father navigate treacherous waters that few outside the palace walls could ever imagine. The integration of Camilla's children into the royal fold has created ripples that have grown into waves, and now those waves threaten to become a tsunami that could change everything. This is not just a story about titles and inheritance. It's about a man caught between his role as a son, a future king, and a protector of an institution that has survived wars, scandals, and revolution. But can it survive what's coming next? Some secrets are too dangerous to keep, and some truths too powerful to ignore. When the guard finally can't hold back anymore, the words that spill out will either heal a fractured family or tear it apart forever. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany table as Prince William pushed his untouched dinner around his plate. The private dining room at Clarence's house felt suffocating tonight despite its grandeur and the careful attention of the household staff. Across from him, his father King Charles III spoke animatedly about the upcoming state visit, his enthusiasm evident in every gesture. But William's mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts that had been building like pressure in a kettle for months. Catherine noticed his distraction immediately. After 15 years of marriage, she could read his moods like a familiar book. The way his jaw tensed slightly, how his fingers drummed silently against the table's edge, the distant look in his eyes that appeared whenever the subject of family dynamics arose. She reached over and gently placed her hand on his, a small gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Charles, who paused mid-sentence. "Everything all right, William?" Charles asked, his voice carrying that particular tone of concern that fathers use when they sense their children are troubled. The king's weathered hands folded carefully in his lap, and his blue eyes searched his son's face for clues about what was bothering him. William looked up, startled from his reverie. For a moment he considered brushing off his father's concern with a polite smile and a change of subject. It's what he'd been doing for months now, keeping his growing anxiety locked away behind the careful facade that royal training had taught him to maintain. But tonight felt different. Tonight the weight of unspoken words felt heavier than the future crown he would one day wear. "Actually, Papa, there is something," William began, his voice steady but with an undertone that made Catherine squeeze his hand supportively. "It's about Tom and Laura, about their growing influence in family matters." Charles's expression shifted subtly, the enthusiasm from moments before replaced by something more guarded. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez, Camilla's children from her first marriage, had indeed become more prominent figures in royal circles since their mother became queen consort. What had once been occasional appearances at family gatherings had evolved into regular involvement in planning sessions, charitable patronages, and even informal advisory roles. "They're family now, William," Charles said carefully, his diplomatic training evident in how he chose each word. "When I married Camilla, I didn't just marry her. I embraced her entire family just as she embraced ours. Tom and Laura have proven themselves to be valuable allies and trusted confidants." William felt his chest tighten. This was exactly the response he'd expected, and exactly what he feared. The rational part of his mind understood his father's position. Blended families required integration and acceptance, but the part of him that had grown up watching his mother struggle with the complexities of royal marriage, who had seen firsthand how outside influences could destabilize even the strongest foundations, couldn't shake his growing unease. "It's not about them being family, Papa," William said, his voice growing stronger. "It's about the precedent we're setting. Tom has been consulting on communication strategies for major royal announcements. Laura has been involved in selecting which charities receive royal patronage. These aren't just ceremonial roles anymore. They're substantive positions of influence within the monarchy itself." Catherine watched the exchange with growing concern. She'd witnessed many conversations between father and son over the years, but there was something different about this one. An intensity, an urgency, that suggested this went deeper than a simple disagreement about family roles. She'd noticed William's increasing anxiety over recent months, the way he'd grown quiet during family meetings, the hours he'd spend in his study late at night, staring out the window as if wrestling with invisible demons. Charles leaned back in his chair, his fingers forming a steeple as he considered his response. The gesture was familiar to both William and Catherine. It was something the king did when he needed time to process complex emotions or difficult situations. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. "You're concerned about overreach," Charles said finally, his voice thoughtful rather than defensive. "You're worried that by involving Tom and Laura in substantive matters, we're fundamentally altering the nature of the monarchy itself." "Exactly," William replied, relief evident in his voice that his father understood the core of his concern. "For centuries, the monarchy has maintained its stability through careful adherence to tradition and protocol. Yes, we've modernized and adapted, but always within established frameworks. What we're doing now feels different. It feels like we're creating new precedents without fully considering their long-term implications." Catherine decided to join the conversation, her natural diplomacy serving as a bridge between father and son. "Perhaps we could find a middle ground," she suggested gently. "Ways to honor the family bonds while maintaining institutional boundaries." Charles looked at his daughter-in-law with appreciation. Catherine had always been skilled at finding solutions that honored everyone's concerns while maintaining harmony. It was one of the qualities that made her such an effective future queen. "What specific changes would you suggest?" Charles asked, his tone indicating genuine interest rather than defensive resistance. William had clearly given this considerable thought. He pulled out his phone and opened a notes app, scrolling through what appeared to be extensive documentation. "I've been keeping track," he said, a slight embarrassment coloring his voice. "Not because I'm trying to build a case against Tom and Laura personally, but because I wanted to understand the scope of their involvement before raising concerns." He began reading from his notes, his voice growing more confident as he outlined his observations. "In the past 6 months, Tom has attended 12 strategy meetings for major royal communications. He's provided input on everything from the Christmas message to responses to parliamentary questions about royal finances. Laura has been consulted on the selection of new patronages, has attended 4 private meetings with charity representatives, and has been involved in planning 3 major royal events." Charles listened intently, his expression revealing that he hadn't fully realized the extent of his stepchildren's involvement. "I see," he said quietly, the weight of William's documentation clearly having an impact. "It's not that they're not capable or well-intentioned," William continued, his voice earnest. "But these are roles that have traditionally been filled by members of the core royal family, or by long-time institutional staff who've earned their positions through years of service and demonstrated loyalty to the crown above all else personal relationships." The conversation was interrupted by the soft chime of the dinner service bell, signaling that the household staff were ready to clear the table and serve dessert. But none of the 3 showed any interest in continuing the meal. The food had grown cold while they'd been talking, and the atmosphere had shifted from casual family dinner to something much more consequential. "Perhaps we should move to the library," Charles suggested, recognizing that this conversation was far from over and would benefit from a more comfortable setting. The library at Clarence House was Charles's favorite room, filled with his personal collection of books on history, philosophy, and organic farming. It was a space where he felt most himself, away from the formal trappings of kingship. As they made their way through the corridors, past portraits of previous monarchs and carefully maintained displays of royal memorabilia, William felt a strange mixture of anxiety and relief. For months he'd been carrying these concerns alone, sharing them only partially with Catherine late at night when the children were asleep and they had privacy to discuss sensitive matters. Finally giving voice to his fears felt liberating, but it also made them more real, more urgent. The library was warm and inviting, with a fire crackling softly in the fireplace and comfortable leather chairs arranged around a low table. Charles poured himself a brandy and offered the same to William, who declined in favor of tea. Catherine accepted a glass of wine, knowing that this conversation would likely continue for some time. "Tell me about your deeper concerns," Charles said as they settled into their chairs. "Beyond the practical matters of protocol and precedent. What's really worrying you, William?" This was the question William had been both hoping for and dreading. The surface issues of protocol and procedure were easier to discuss than the deeper fears that kept him awake at night. But his father's gentle probing indicated a readiness to hear whatever William needed to share. "I'm worried about loyalty," William said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not personal loyalty. I believe Tom and Laura care about you and Camilla genuinely. But institutional loyalty, loyalty to the crown as an entity that transcends personal relationships and individual interests." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "When someone's primary allegiance is to their parent rather than to the institution, it creates potential for conflicts of interest that we may not even recognize until it's too late." What happens when protecting Camilla's interests conflicts with protecting the monarchy's interests? What happens when family loyalty and institutional duty point in different directions? Charles was quiet for a long moment, his brandy snifter rotating slowly in his hands as he absorbed his son's words. These were not casual concerns or petty jealousies. These were the kinds of fundamental questions that had shaped royal policy for generations. The kinds of issues that could determine whether the monarchy thrived or merely survived in the coming decades. "You're thinking about your mother," Charles said finally, his voice gentle but direct. It wasn't a question. William's composure cracked slightly, a flash of old pain crossing his features before he regained control. "Partly," he admitted, "but it's bigger than that. I'm thinking about the institution itself, about what we owe to the people of Britain and the Commonwealth, about the responsibility that comes with being custodians of something larger than ourselves." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and Catherine found herself thinking about her own children, about Prince George, who would one day sit where his grandfather and father now sat, wrestling with similar questions about duty and family, tradition and change. The weight of generational responsibility felt particularly heavy in moments like these. "I want to understand your solution," Charles said, leaning forward slightly. "If the current arrangement is problematic, what would you propose instead?" William set down his teacup with deliberate care, the fine china making the softest sound against the saucer. The question hung in the air between them, and he realized that for all his months of worry and analysis, he hadn't fully formulated a concrete solution. He'd been so focused on identifying the problems that he hadn't devoted equal energy to imagining alternatives. "I think we need to establish clearer boundaries," he said slowly, working through his thoughts as he spoke. "Not walls, but boundaries. Ways to honor family relationships while preserving institutional integrity." Charles nodded encouragingly, and William felt a surge of gratitude for his father's patience. Despite the sensitive nature of their discussion, despite the fact that they were essentially questioning decisions Charles had made as king, his father was listening with genuine openness rather than defensive resistance. "For instance," William continued, his voice gaining strength, "we could create a formal advisory structure that includes Tom and Laura in appropriate capacities while ensuring that final decisions on institutional matters remain with working members of the royal family. They could provide valuable perspectives and expertise without having direct influence over policy." Catherine found herself impressed by her husband's diplomatic approach. Rather than demanding wholesale changes, he was suggesting modifications that could address his concerns while respecting his father's family bonds. It was exactly the kind of nuanced thinking that would serve him well as king. "That sounds reasonable in principle," Charles said thoughtfully. "But I wonder if you're not also concerned about public perception."
About how the British people might view the involvement of my stepchildren in royal affairs.
This was indeed one of William's concerns, though he'd hesitated to raise it directly. Public opinion polls consistently showed that while the British people had largely accepted Camilla as queen consort, there remained some skepticism about extending royal status and privileges to her children.
The monarchy's stability depended partly on public support, and anything that might erode that support deserved careful consideration. "The public has been remarkably patient with our family's evolution," William said carefully. "But patience isn't infinite. We've seen how quickly public opinion can shift when people feel that the monarchy is becoming too removed from its core purpose or too influenced by personal rather than national interests." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the library door. Charles's private secretary, Sir Jeremy, entered with an apologetic expression and a folder of documents that clearly couldn't wait until morning. The interruption reminded all three of them that even private family conversations took place within the context of ongoing royal duties and responsibilities. "Your Majesty, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt," Sir Jeremy said, his professional demeanor carefully neutral despite the obvious importance of whatever documents he carried. "But the Prime Minister's office has requested an urgent consultation on tomorrow's parliamentary statement regarding the trade delegation to Japan." Charles accepted the folder with the practiced ease of someone who'd grown accustomed to having personal time interrupted by matters of state. As he quickly reviewed the contents, William found himself reflecting on how their current conversation exemplified the very issues he'd been raising. Here they were, trying to discuss fundamental questions about the monarchy's future, while immediate political and diplomatic pressures demanded attention. "I'll need 20 minutes to review this properly," Charles said to his secretary, then turned to William and Catherine. "Shall we continue this conversation tomorrow evening? I think we're making good progress, and I'd like to give these matters the attention they deserve." William felt a mixture of disappointment and relief. Part of him wanted to continue working through these issues immediately, while their conversation had momentum and emotional honesty. But another part of him welcomed the opportunity to reflect on what had been shared and to consider how to approach the more difficult aspects of their discussion. "Of course, Papa," William replied. "But before we adjourn, I want to say how much I appreciate your willingness to hear my concerns. I know this isn't easy to discuss." Charles stood and walked over to his son, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that was both paternal and regal. "These are exactly the kinds of conversations we need to have, William. The monarchy's strength has always come from its ability to evolve thoughtfully while maintaining its essential character. Your concerns aren't criticisms, they're contributions to that evolution." After Charles left to deal with the parliamentary matter, William and Catherine remained in the library, both lost in their own thoughts. The fire had burned down to glowing embers and the room felt quieter, more intimate without the king's presence. "How do you feel about how that went?" Catherine asked, moving to sit closer to her husband on the leather sofa. William considered the question carefully. "Better than I expected," he said finally. "I was worried he'd see my concerns as personal attacks or as challenges to his authority. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in understanding my perspective." "That's because they are valid concerns," Catherine replied, "and because you presented them thoughtfully, focused on the institution rather than on personalities." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing the evening's conversation. Outside, London continued its evening rhythm, oblivious to the royal family discussions taking place behind palace walls. It struck William that millions of people went about their daily lives trusting that the monarchy was being managed responsibly, without ever knowing about conversations like the one they'd just had. "There's something else," William said quietly. "Something I didn't feel ready to discuss with Papa tonight." Catherine turned to face him fully, recognizing the tone that indicated he was about to share something particularly difficult or sensitive. "I've been having dreams," he continued. "Not nightmares exactly, but troubling dreams about the future. About what happens when I become king and inherit not just the crown, but all the complexities we're creating now." He paused, staring into the dying embers of the fire. "In these dreams, I'm trying to make decisions about the Commonwealth, about state visits, about matters of real consequence, and I'm surrounded by advisors whose primary loyalties I'm not certain of, people who mean well, who care about the royal family, but whose understanding of constitutional monarchy comes through personal relationships rather than institutional training." Catherine felt a chill despite the warm room. She'd noticed William's restless sleep in recent months, the way he'd sometimes wake in the early morning hours and sit by the window, lost in thought. Now she understood what had been troubling him. "These aren't just concerns about current arrangements," she said, understanding dawning in her voice. "You're worried about establishing precedents that will constrain your own reign before it even begins." "Exactly," William replied, relief evident in his voice that she understood. "Every decision we make now becomes part of the institutional memory. Every precedent we set now becomes an expectation for the future. If Tom and Laura become integral to royal decision-making during Papa's reign, how do I change that arrangement when I become king without appearing to reject family or break with established practice?" It was a sophisticated analysis that revealed the depth of William's thinking about kingship. He wasn't just considering immediate practical concerns but long-term constitutional implications. The weight of future responsibility was already shaping his current decisions, just as it had shaped his father's decisions, and would someday shape Prince George's. "Have you discussed any of this with anyone else?" Catherine asked. William shook his head. "Only with you, and only partially. I didn't want to seem like I was building an opposition coalition or going behind Papa's back. But I also didn't feel ready to have this conversation until I'd thought through my concerns more thoroughly." Catherine understood his caution. Royal families were particularly susceptible to misunderstandings and hurt feelings when members felt excluded from important discussions. The last thing William would want would be for Charles to discover that his son had been discussing concerns about royal policy with others before raising them directly. "What about talking to Anne?" Catherine suggested. "She's always been direct about institutional matters, and she has the perspective of having watched the monarchy evolve over decades." Princess Anne, William's aunt, was indeed known for her straightforward approach to royal duties and her fierce loyalty to the institution above personal considerations. She'd navigated her own complex family situations with grace and had earned respect across the political spectrum for her dedication and competence. "That's not a bad idea," William mused. "Anne has never been afraid to ask difficult questions or to challenge conventional wisdom when she thinks it's necessary, and she's completely above suspicion when it comes to personal motivations or hidden agendas." They continued talking late into the evening, working through various aspects of the situation and potential approaches for the following day's conversation with Charles. By the time they finally retired, William felt more prepared and less alone with his concerns. The next morning brought the usual flurry of royal duties and responsibilities. William had a breakfast meeting with representatives from several military charities, followed by a review of upcoming state visits. and their potential implications for British trade relationships. The normal rhythm of royal work provided a welcome respite from the emotional intensity of family discussions. But throughout the day, he found his mind returning to the previous evening's conversation and to the broader questions it had raised. During a brief break between appointments, he called Princess Anne and asked if she might be available for a private lunch later in the week. Her immediate agreement, without questions about the purpose of the meeting, reminded him why she was so respected within the family and the institution. That afternoon brought unexpected news that would add new dimensions to their family discussions. Sir Jeremy appeared at William's office with a confidential briefing paper that had just arrived from the Cabinet Office. The government was considering new legislation that would formalize certain aspects of royal family roles and responsibilities, partly in response to public questions about accountability and partly as a preemptive measure to avoid future constitutional crises. The proposed legislation was complex and would require careful study, but its basic premise was to create clearer legal frameworks around who could exercise what kinds of royal authority and under what circumstances. It was exactly the kind of external pressure that could either complicate their family discussions or provide a useful framework for resolving some of the issues William had raised. As he reviewed the briefing paper, William realized that their private family concerns were taking place within a broader public and political context that was itself evolving. The monarchy couldn't make decisions in isolation from parliamentary oversight, public opinion, or international expectations. Whatever solutions they developed would need to work within these external constraints. That evening's dinner at Clarence House felt different from the previous night's gathering. Charles had clearly spent considerable time thinking about their conversation, and he opened the evening by sharing some of his own reflections on the issues William had raised. "I've been wondering," Charles said as they settled into the library after dinner, "whether part of the challenge we're facing is that we're trying to solve 21st century problems with 20th century approaches." Charles's observation hung in the air like an invitation to explore completely new territory. William felt a spark of excitement mixed with apprehension. His father's willingness to question fundamental assumptions suggested an openness to more radical solutions than he'd dared hope for. "What do you mean exactly?" William asked, settling deeper into his chair and preparing for what might be a very different kind of conversation than the previous evenings. Charles stood and walked to the tall windows overlooking the gardens, his hands clasped behind his back, in the familiar pose he adopted when working through complex problems. The evening light cast long shadows across the room, and for a moment he looked less like a king and more like the philosopher and deep thinker he'd always been. "I mean that perhaps we're approaching this from the wrong angle entirely," Charles said, his voice thoughtful. "We're trying to figure out how to accommodate Tom and Laura within existing structures, but maybe the real question is whether those existing structures serve the modern monarchy effectively at all." Catherine exchanged a quick glance with William, both recognizing that this conversation was about to venture into territory that could reshape their understanding of their roles and responsibilities. Charles continued, seemingly unaware of the subtle communication between his son and daughter-in-law. "The monarchy I inherited was designed for a different world," Charles continued. "A world where royal families were smaller, where the distinction between working royals and extended family was clearer, where public scrutiny was less intense and public expectations were different. We've been making incremental adjustments for decades, but maybe it's time to consider more fundamental reforms." William felt his pulse quicken. This was far beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd first decided to raise his concerns about Tom and Laura. His father wasn't just willing to discuss boundary adjustments, he was questioning the entire framework within which they operated. "Are you suggesting we completely restructure how the royal family functions?" William asked, trying to keep his voice neutral, despite his growing excitement and anxiety. "I'm suggesting we at least consider it," Charles replied, turning back to face them. "Look at the Scandinavian monarchies, or the Dutch royal family. They found ways to modernize their institutions while maintaining public support and constitutional stability. Why couldn't we do something similar?" The reference to other European monarchies was particularly intriguing. Both the Swedish and Norwegian royal families had successfully streamlined their operations in recent decades, reducing the number of working royals while maintaining effective ceremonial and constitutional functions. The Dutch monarchy had been especially innovative in finding ways to balance tradition with contemporary expectations. "What specifically are you thinking about?" Catherine asked, her natural curiosity overcoming any caution about encouraging what might be a very disruptive conversation. Charles returned to his seat and leaned forward, his enthusiasm for the subject evident in his body language. "Several things, actually. First, we could formalize the distinction between working royals and family members who have royal titles but don't perform official duties. Second, we could create clearer advisory structures that incorporate expertise from both within and outside the traditional royal establishment. Third, we could develop more transparent processes for decision-making that would actually strengthen rather than weaken the monarchy's credibility. William found himself both thrilled and terrified by the scope of what his father was suggesting. These weren't minor adjustments. They were fundamental reforms that would change how the monarchy operated for generations to come. But wouldn't such changes require parliamentary approval? William asked. And wouldn't they open us up to exactly the kind of political interference we've spent centuries learning to avoid? It was a valid concern. One of the monarchy's greatest strengths had always been its ability to operate within constitutional frameworks while maintaining independence from partisan political pressures. Any formal restructuring would necessarily involve Parliament and potentially subject royal family decisions to legislative oversight. Not necessarily, Charles replied. Many of these changes could be implemented through internal reforms and modified conventions rather than formal legislation. The key would be making changes that strengthen the monarchy's effectiveness and public support rather than ones that appear to be driven by personal convenience or family politics. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Camilla, who appeared in the library doorway with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but Tom has just called with some rather urgent news about the media strategy for next week's Commonwealth reception." The timing of her appearance felt almost surreal given the nature of their discussion. Here they were, talking about fundamental reforms to royal structures, and Camilla was sharing news about Tom's involvement in exactly the kind of strategic planning that had sparked William's original concerns. "What's the urgency?" Charles asked, his tone carefully neutral despite the obvious sensitivity of the moment. "Apparently there are rumors circulating that several Commonwealth leaders are planning to raise questions about the monarchy's future during their private meetings next week," Camilla explained, seemingly unaware of the broader context of their conversation. "Tom thinks we need to prepare more comprehensive briefing materials for those discussions." William felt a chill run down his spine. The convergence of their private family discussions with external political pressures felt ominous, as if the universe was forcing them to confront these issues whether they felt ready or not. "Did Tom suggest any specific approaches?" Charles asked. "He's drafted some preliminary talking points that emphasize the monarchy's evolution and modernization," Camilla replied. "He thinks we should be proactive in addressing questions about relevance and adaptation rather than waiting for others to set the agenda." William exchanged another glance with Catherine, both recognizing the irony of the situation. Tom Parker Bowles was essentially proposing the same kind of proactive approach to institutional reform that they'd been discussing, but from his position as an informal advisor rather than as a constitutional participant in royal decision-making. "Thank you for letting us know," Charles said to Camilla. "We'll need to review Tom's materials carefully and coordinate our response with the broader strategic planning we've been discussing." After Camilla left to return Tom's call, the three of them sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes. The intersection of their private family concerns with immediate political pressures had added new urgency to their discussions. "This is exactly what I was worried about," William said quietly. "Tom is essentially setting strategic direction for how the monarchy responds to constitutional questions, but he's doing so without formal accountability or clear institutional oversight." Charles nodded slowly, and for the first time since they'd begun these conversations, he looked troubled rather than merely thoughtful. "I see your point more clearly now," he admitted. "It's not that Tom lacks good judgment or good intentions, but that his involvement in these matters creates ambiguities about authority and responsibility that could become problematic." Catherine decided to voice a concern that had been building in her mind throughout their discussions. "There's another dimension to consider," she said carefully. "How do these arrangements affect Camilla's position and well-being? She's navigating her own complex transition to being queen consort, and having her children's roles become a source of family tension could put her in an impossible situation."
It was a perceptive observation that added emotional complexity to what might otherwise be treated as purely institutional questions.
Camilla had spent decades earning acceptance within the royal family and among the British public. The last thing anyone wanted was for her to feel that her family relationships were being sacrificed to institutional concerns. "That's exactly why we need to find solutions that honor all the relationships involved," William replied. "I don't want Tom and Laura to feel rejected or excluded, and I certainly don't want Camilla to feel that accepting the crown came at the cost of her children's standing within the family." Charles looked at both of them with obvious appreciation for their sensitivity to the human dimensions of their institutional challenges. "This is why these conversations are so valuable," he said. "We're not just solving administrative problems. We're trying to preserve and strengthen family bonds while serving the broader constitutional responsibilities we've inherited. The evening was growing late, but none of them seemed ready to end the conversation. The combination of philosophical discussion about institutional reform and immediate practical concerns about next week's Commonwealth reception had created a sense of momentum that was hard to interrupt. "I have an idea," William said suddenly. "What if we used next week's Commonwealth meetings as a kind of test case? We could develop a more formal process for strategic planning and decision-making that includes Tom and Laura in appropriate roles while ensuring clear lines of authority and accountability." Charles raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the suggestion. "What exactly do you have in mind?" "We could establish a formal royal communications committee that includes representatives from different parts of the royal household," William explained, his enthusiasm growing as he developed the idea. Tom could serve as an external consultant to that committee, providing valuable expertise without having direct decision-making authority. Laura could play a similar role for charitable and patronage matters. Catherine found herself impressed by the elegance of William's proposal. It addressed his concerns about institutional boundaries while creating meaningful roles for Tom and Laura that honored their expertise and family relationships. The committee structure would also create more transparency and accountability, she added, building on William's idea. Decisions would be made through established processes rather than informal conversations, and there would be clear records of who was involved in what decisions. Charles was quiet for several minutes, clearly thinking through the implications of what they were suggesting. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of cautious optimism. "It's worth exploring," he said. "But we'd need to be very careful about how we implement something like this. Any changes to existing arrangements would need to be handled sensitively to avoid creating the impression that we're responding to external pressure or internal conflicts." The conversation continued for another hour, with all three of them contributing ideas and refinements to what was becoming a fairly comprehensive proposal for institutional reform. By the time they finally decided to adjourn, they had the outline of a plan that could address William's concerns while strengthening rather than weakening family relationships. But as William and Catherine made their way back to their own residence, both were aware that the hardest conversation still lay ahead. They would need to discuss these ideas with Tom and Laura directly, and they would need to navigate the complex politics of implementing institutional changes within a system that valued tradition and stability above innovation and reform. "Do you think this will actually work?" Catherine asked as they walked through the quiet corridors of Clarence House. William considered her question carefully. "I think it has a chance," he said finally, "but success will depend on everyone being willing to put institutional interests above personal preferences, and that's not always easy for families to do." 3 days later, William found himself sitting across from Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes in the small private dining room at Kensington Palace. The setting was deliberately informal, designed to encourage open conversation rather than defensive positioning, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. Both of Camilla's children had accepted his invitation to lunch with polite enthusiasm, though neither had pressed for details about the purpose of the meeting. Catherine had offered to join them, but William had decided this was a conversation that would benefit from directness rather than diplomatic smoothing. The preliminary discussions with his father had gone better than expected, but William knew that the real test would come in explaining their concerns and proposed solutions to the people most directly affected. Tom arrived first, his easy confidence immediately apparent in the way he moved through the palace corridors, as if he belonged there. At 47, he had built a successful career as a food critic and author, and his comfort with public attention had made him a natural choice for involvement in royal communications strategies. His relationship with the media was sophisticated and generally positive, qualities that had proved valuable to the royal family. Laura followed 10 minutes later, apologizing for traffic delays with the kind of grace that suggested she was genuinely sorry rather than merely observing social conventions. At 45, she had managed to maintain a much lower public profile than her brother, while still being actively involved in various charitable endeavors. Her background in art curation and gallery management had informed her contributions to discussions about royal patronage and cultural initiatives. "Thank you both for making time for this," William began as they settled around the table. "I wanted to have a conversation about the royal family's evolving structure and how we can best serve both family relationships and institutional responsibilities going forward." Tom and Laura exchanged a quick glance, both clearly recognizing that this was not going to be a casual social lunch. Their body language remained relaxed, but William could see increased attention and perhaps a touch of wariness in their expressions.
"That sounds important," Laura said diplomatically. "Are there specific concerns or developments that have prompted this discussion?"
William appreciated her directness.
Rather than dancing around the subject, she was inviting him to state his purposes clearly. which would make the conversation more efficient and honest. There are, William replied. Over the past several months, I've been thinking about how the monarchy needs to evolve to remain effective and credible in the 21st century. Part of that evolution involves clarifying roles and responsibilities for everyone connected to the institution. Tom leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. I sense there's more to this than general institutional planning, he said with the kind of perceptiveness that had made him an effective communications advisor. Are you concerned about specific aspects of how Laura and I have been involved in royal activities? The direct question created an opening for exactly the kind of honest conversation William had hoped for. Rather than requiring him to build up to his concerns gradually, Tom was inviting him to address them head-on. I am, William said, matching Tom's directness. Not because I question your capabilities or your commitment to supporting the monarchy, but because I believe we need clearer structures and boundaries to ensure long-term institutional stability. Laura set down her water glass and gave William her full attention. Can you be more specific about what kinds of boundaries you're thinking about? William had prepared carefully for this moment, knowing that how he presented his concerns would largely determine whether this conversation led to productive solutions or family tensions that could persist for years. Currently, both of you are involved in substantive decision-making processes that have traditionally been handled by working members of the royal family or by senior household staff with formal institutional accountability, he explained. Tom, you've been instrumental in developing communication strategies for major royal announcements. Laura, you've been involved in selecting charitable patronages and planning significant royal events. He paused, giving them time to process his observations before continuing. These aren't ceremonial roles or occasional consultations. They're ongoing responsibilities that affect how the monarchy operates and how it's perceived by the public and by other institutions. Tom nodded slowly, and William could see that he was taking the concerns seriously rather than dismissing them. I can understand how that might create ambiguities, Tom said thoughtfully. When someone like me is involved in strategic planning, it's not always clear whether I'm speaking as a family member, as an external consultant, or as some kind of informal representative of royal interests.
Exactly, William replied, feeling relief that Tom understood the complexity of the situation. And those ambiguities could become problematic if they're not addressed proactively. Laura had been listening intently, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of concern that hadn't been there at the beginning of their conversation. Are you suggesting that our current level of involvement is inappropriate or harmful to the monarchy's interests? It was a fair question that went to the heart of William's concerns. He needed to be honest about his worries while avoiding language that would make Tom and Laura feel personally attacked or rejected. I'm concerned about precedent and accountability, William said carefully. Every arrangement we establish now becomes part of the institutional memory and creates expectations for the future. If informal advisory roles become institutionalized without clear frameworks for authority and responsibility, we could face constitutional or political challenges that we're not prepared for. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their lunch, and for a few minutes they focused on the practical matters of serving and settling themselves with their meals. The brief pause gave all three of them time to process what had been shared so far and to consider how to approach the more difficult aspects of their discussion. I think I understand your concerns better now, Tom said as they resumed their conversation, but I'm curious about what solutions you might propose. Are you suggesting that Laura and I should step back from involvement in royal activities entirely? The question revealed both Tom's intelligence and his emotional investment in his current role. He wasn't simply asking for information. He was probing to understand whether William's concerns would result in his exclusion from activities that had become meaningful to him. Not at all, William replied quickly. Papa and I have actually been discussing ways to create more formal structures that would allow you to contribute your expertise while establishing clearer boundaries and accountability measures. Laura looked intrigued rather than defensive, which William took as an encouraging sign. What kind of formal structures, she asked. William outlined the committee-based approach they had discussed, explaining how both Tom and Laura could serve as external consultants to formal royal communications and charitable patronage committees. The structure would preserve their ability to contribute while ensuring that final decisions remained with working members of the royal family, and that all advisory processes were properly documented and accountable. That actually sounds like it could be more effective than current arrangements, Tom said, surprising William with his positive response. Right now, my involvement is fairly ad hoc, which means I sometimes feel like I'm operating without clear guidance or parameters. A more structured approach might actually make my contributions more valuable. Laura nodded in agreement. I've sometimes wondered about the same thing, she admitted. When I'm consulted about patronage decisions,
I'm never entirely sure about the scope of my role, or how my recommendations fit into broader strategic planning. William felt a wave of relief and gratitude. Tom and Laura's willingness to engage constructively with his concerns suggested that solutions might be possible without creating the kind of family divisions he'd feared. There's another dimension we need to discuss, William continued, feeling encouraged enough to address more sensitive issues: public perception and media coverage of royal family activities. Both Tom and Laura became more attentive, recognizing that media relations were particularly complex for people connected to the royal family but not fully part of it. The British public has been remarkably accepting of the royal family's evolution, William said. But that acceptance isn't unlimited, and it's not unconditional. We need to be thoughtful about how changes in family structure and roles are presented and perceived. Tom's professional experience with media relations made him particularly attuned to this aspect of their discussion. Are you concerned about specific coverage or about general trends in how our involvement is being reported? Both, William replied. There have been occasional articles questioning the appropriateness of non-royal family members having influence over royal decisions. More broadly, I'm concerned that if these arrangements aren't properly structured and explained, they could become targets for critics who want to undermine the monarchy's credibility or constitutional position. Laura looked thoughtful. So part of what you're suggesting is that clearer structures would actually protect all of us, the institution, the working royals, and people like Tom and me, from potential criticism or misunderstanding. Precisely, William said, pleased that she grasped the protective aspects of what he was proposing. Informal arrangements that work well in private can become liabilities if they're subjected to hostile public scrutiny or parliamentary questioning. The conversation continued for another hour, with all three of them exploring various aspects of the proposed structural changes and their potential implications. By the time they reached coffee and dessert, William felt confident that Tom and Laura understood his concerns and were genuinely interested in finding solutions that would serve everyone's interests. I have one more question, Laura said as they were preparing to conclude their lunch. How does Camilla feel about these potential changes? We wouldn't want to put her in the position of choosing between supporting institutional reforms and protecting her children's relationships with the royal family. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful question William had hoped someone would raise. Camilla's well-being and comfort were essential to the success of any proposed changes, and her support would be crucial for implementing structural reforms without creating family tensions. Papa and I have discussed this extensively, William replied. We both recognize that any changes need to strengthen rather than complicate Camilla's position as queen consort. That's why we're looking for solutions that honor family relationships while establishing clearer institutional frameworks. Tom leaned forward, his expression serious. What would you need from us to move forward with exploring these ideas? The question demonstrated exactly the kind of constructive engagement William had hoped for. Rather than focusing on potential problems or personal concerns, Tom was asking how he and Laura could contribute to developing solutions. Honestly, what you've given me today, William replied. Your willingness to engage with these concerns openly and your interest in finding approaches that serve the institution's long-term interests while preserving family relationships. As they prepared to leave, Laura asked one final question that revealed her understanding of the broader implications of their discussion.
When do you think we might be able to have a conversation that includes Camilla and Papa?
It seems like any next steps would need to involve all the affected family members. William appreciated both the question and the inclusive spirit behind it. I think we're ready for that conversation soon, he said. Papa is already supportive of exploring structural changes, and I suspect Camilla will be as well once she understands how these arrangements could actually strengthen rather than complicate family dynamics. The lunch concluded with all three feeling that they had made genuine progress toward understanding each other's perspectives and identifying potential solutions. But as William reflected on the conversation later that afternoon, he realized that the hardest part still lay ahead. Implementing changes that would satisfy institutional requirements while maintaining the family harmony that was essential to the monarchy's stability. 2 weeks later, the entire extended royal family gathered at Balmoral Castle for what Charles had described simply as a family discussion about our future together. The Scottish Highlands provided the perfect backdrop for serious conversation far from London's political pressures and media attention. The castle's library, with its comfortable leather chairs and walls lined with books collected by generations of monarchs, had hosted many important family meetings over the decades. William arrived early, wanting time to review his notes and prepare mentally for what could be the most consequential family conversation of his adult life. The past 2 weeks had been spent in careful preparation, consulting with constitutional experts, reviewing precedents from other European monarchies, and refining the proposals that had emerged from his discussions with his father and with Tom and Laura. Catherine joined him in the library carrying a folder of materials they had prepared together. Their partnership in working through these complex issues had strengthened their own relationship and given William confidence that they were approaching the challenges thoughtfully rather than reactively. "How are you feeling?" Catherine asked, settling into the chair beside his and reviewing the agenda they had developed. "Nervous but optimistic," William replied honestly. "The individual conversations have all gone better than I expected, but bringing everyone together introduces new dynamics that are hard to predict." Charles arrived next, accompanied by Camilla, whose expression suggested both apprehension and determination. She had spent considerable time over the past 2 weeks discussing the proposed changes with Tom and Laura, and William hoped that those conversations had been as constructive as his own had been. Tom and Laura arrived together, both looking serious but not defensive. Their body language suggested they had discussed strategy for the meeting, but William hoped their coordination was focused on finding solutions rather than protecting existing arrangements. Princess Anne was the last to arrive, bringing with her the kind of no-nonsense perspective that could cut through emotional complications and focus attention on practical realities. Her presence added institutional gravitas to what might otherwise feel like purely personal family negotiation. "Thank you all for making time for this," Charles began once everyone was seated. "As you know, we're here to discuss how our family can best serve both our personal relationships and our institutional responsibilities as we move forward." He gestured to William, who had been designated to present the background and rationale for the proposed changes. William stood, feeling the weight of the moment and the importance of getting his presentation right. "Over the past month, we've been discussing concerns about role clarity, institutional accountability, and long-term sustainability of current arrangements," William began. "These discussions have led to some promising ideas about structural improvements that could strengthen both family bonds and institutional effectiveness." He outlined the committee-based approach they had developed, explaining how it would create formal frameworks for advisory roles while ensuring clear lines of authority and accountability. The presentation took nearly 20 minutes, with William careful to address both practical and emotional aspects of the proposed changes. When he finished, the room was quiet for several minutes while everyone processed what he had shared. Anne was the first to speak, her characteristic directness cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "These seem like sensible proposals," she said, "but their success will depend entirely on implementation. Good structures can fail with poor execution, and even imperfect structures can work well if everyone approaches them with good faith and institutional commitment." Tom nodded in agreement. "I appreciate the thoughtfulness that has gone into developing these ideas," he said. "Laura and I have discussed them extensively since our lunch with William, and we think they could actually improve our ability to contribute effectively while reducing the ambiguities that have sometimes made our roles unclear." Camilla had been listening intently, and when she spoke, her voice carried both gratitude and concern. "I want to make sure that everyone understands how much I appreciate the careful way these concerns have been raised and discussed," she said. "It would have been easy for family tensions to develop around these issues, but instead we've had thoughtful conversations that have strengthened rather than strained our relationships." She paused, looking around the room at each person present. "At the same time, I want to be honest about my concerns. Tom and Laura's involvement in royal activities has been meaningful to me personally, not just because they're my children, but because their contributions have been valuable. I need to feel confident that these structural changes will enhance rather than diminish their ability to support the monarchy." It was exactly the kind of honest statement that William had hoped for. Camilla was expressing her concerns directly rather than allowing them to simmer beneath the surface, which created opportunities for direct response and reassurance.
"That's precisely why we focused on creating formal advisory roles rather than simply reducing informal involvement," Catherine responded. "The committee structure should actually increase Tom and Laura's effectiveness by giving them clearer mandates and better integration with overall strategic planning." Charles had been listening to the discussion with obvious satisfaction, and when he spoke, his tone suggested that the conversation was proceeding exactly as he had hoped.
"I think we have the foundation for a constructive approach," he said. "But before we move to implementation planning, I want to address a broader question that has been implicit in our discussions, but hasn't been stated directly." He stood and walked to the window overlooking the castle's grounds, his posture suggesting he was about to address something particularly important. "Public expectations of transparency and accountability are increasing. Parliamentary oversight of royal activities is becoming more detailed. International pressures on constitutional monarchies are growing more sophisticated." He turned back to face the group, his expression serious but not pessimistic. "The question isn't whether we need to evolve. We do. The question is whether we can evolve proactively and thoughtfully, maintaining our essential character while adapting to new realities."
William felt a surge of admiration for his father's leadership. Charles was framing their family discussions within the broader historical context that would ultimately determine the monarchy's future success or failure.
The structural changes we're proposing are important, Charles continued, but they're really symptoms of a larger strategic shift toward greater formalization, transparency, and accountability across all aspects of royal operations. Anne leaned forward, clearly interested in this broader strategic perspective.
Are you suggesting that these changes are pilot programs for more comprehensive institutional reforms? I think that's a fair way to describe it, Charles replied. If we can successfully implement improved structures for advisory roles and family involvement, those experiences will inform how we approach other aspects of royal operations that might benefit from similar attention. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, with everyone contributing ideas and refinements to what was becoming a comprehensive plan for institutional modernization. By the time they broke for afternoon tea, they had agreement on the basic framework and a timeline for implementation that would begin with pilot programs before expanding to broader applications.
During the tea break, William found himself in a quiet conversation with Tom and Laura, both of whom seemed genuinely excited about the possibilities the new structures would create. "I have to admit," Tom said, "that I'm looking forward to having clearer guidelines and expectations.
The informal arrangements have been fine, but sometimes I've wondered whether I was being helpful or overstepping bounds." Laura nodded in agreement.
The committee structure should also create opportunities for more systematic input and better coordination with other advisors and staff members. When they reconvened, Camilla asked a question that revealed her sophisticated understanding of the political dimensions of their decisions. How do we communicate these changes to the public and to the Parliament in ways that emphasize institutional strengthening, rather than family conflict or external pressure? It was exactly the right question, and William was pleased to see that their private family discussions had produced shared awareness of public relations challenges. "We've given that considerable thought," he replied, pulling out materials Catherine had prepared on communication strategy.
The key is to frame these changes as proactive modernization rather than reactive problem-solving. The communications plan they had developed emphasized the monarchy's commitment to continuous improvement, institutional transparency, and effective governance. Rather than acknowledging problems with existing arrangements, the public messaging would focus on the benefits of enhanced structures and improved accountability. Anne suggested adding international comparisons to their public communications, noting that other successful European monarchies had implemented similar reforms with positive results. The precedent of institutional modernization in allied nations could provide useful context for British audiences. As the afternoon wore on, William felt growing confidence that they had developed a workable plan that addressed his original concerns while preserving and even strengthening family relationships. The combination of formal structures and informal coordination seemed likely to provide the best of both approaches. "I think we're ready to move forward," Charles said as their discussions began to wind down. "But I want to establish one principle that should guide our implementation efforts." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each person present. "These changes should strengthen rather than burden the monarchy's ability to serve the British people and the Commonwealth. If at any point we discover that structural improvements are creating bureaucratic obstacles or reducing our effectiveness, we'll modify our approach accordingly." The principle of adaptive implementation provided both reassurance and flexibility, acknowledging that even well-intentioned reforms might require adjustment based on practical experience. As they prepared to conclude their meetings, William realized that the family tensions he had feared at the beginning of this process had been replaced by something much more positive: shared commitment to institutional success and family harmony. "Thank you all for approaching these discussions with such openness and good faith," he said to the group.
I think we've demonstrated that it's possible to address complex institutional challenges while strengthening rather than straining family relationships. 3 months later, the new advisory committee structures were operating successfully, and early assessments suggested they were achieving their intended goals of improved accountability and effectiveness. Tom and Laura had settled comfortably into their formal consulting roles, and Camilla had expressed satisfaction with how the changes had actually enhanced rather than diminished her children's ability to support royal activities.
More importantly for William, the sleepless nights and anxiety dreams had largely disappeared. The institutional concerns that had weighed on him for months had been addressed through thoughtful structural improvements, and his confidence in the monarchy's long-term stability had been restored.
The experience had taught him valuable lessons about leadership, family dynamics, and institutional change that would serve him well when he eventually became king. Most significantly, he had learned that apparently intractable problems could often be solved through patient conversation, creative thinking, and genuine commitment to serving interests larger than personal preferences. As he reflected on the process during a quiet evening at home with Catherine and the children, William felt grateful for the family's willingness to wrestle with difficult questions and to implement necessary changes.
The monarchy they would pass on to the next generation would be stronger, more accountable, and more sustainable, because they had been willing to address problems proactively, rather than waiting for external pressures to force unwelcome changes. The Guard had indeed been unable to hold back his concerns, but rather than creating division, his honesty had ultimately strengthened both institution and family in ways that would benefit generations to come.
The Guard can't hold back. Lewis explains his deep fear of Camilla's offspring.